I will talk about culture and mind. We had this morning a discussion about the meaning of culture. Here I approach it in a very broad sense as an anthropologist. So not culture in the sense of a higher elite set of activities, interests, and productions, but much more generally concerning every aspect of human life, every aspect which is one way or another inspired, informed by information transmitted from others. And in fact, I would like to start with suggesting a metaphor, about cultural phenomena. And that's the metaphor. The metaphor is, look at this. I mean, when water flows, you get patterns that form like vortices, eddies, wavelets, and so on. And this happens normally in the flow of water, of a river if you want. And some of these structures are very stable and may stay on and on for a relatively long time. Others, but moving typically and changing shape somewhat. Others are very short-lived. And I want to suggest that something similar is a proper way to approach social and cultural phenomena. A human population is the locus of a huge flow of information, and I'm using information in a very broad sense. Information flows from members to other members of that population through modifications of a common environment, through movement of matter, of course, all the time. And this flow of information is what unites this group, what makes them the group they are. And in this flow of information from one individual to another, but also flow of information inside the minds of individuals and flow of information in very small local interactions, much of it unnoticed, even by the people involved. In this flow of information, there are some patterns, some recurrent patterns, some structure that we may see as stable elements, but they are, and indeed they are stable, but I would want to argue not more stable in their nature than the eddies and whirlpool that you find in a flowing river. So I want you to keep this metaphor in mind as I go along. Every once in a while, Yehuda El-Kana invites me to some conference or workshop on a topic on which I have no special competence. And I initially I used to protest and say, why do you invite me? But, he's got some good idea in mind. I've always enjoyed it, and I hope I've not disappointed him too much. And so, again, I'm not a specialist of enlightenment, neither in the historical sense, nor in its broader sense. So the way maybe in which I can contribute to this symposium is by suggesting a kind of broader framework of thinking about cultural phenomena, a framework which I've been trying to develop over many, many years now, and where one of my goals has been to unite the social, the anthropological, the sociological dimension of a phenomenon with its psychological dimension too. Not at all by reducing the social to the psychological, but by integrating the two pictures. And if actually I may use again a bit my metaphor, if you want to understand these structures in the water, these vortices and so on, you could do just a modeling and not take into account the structure of the matter. But of course, you would be depriving yourself of a fairly crucial explanatory dimension, which is the physics and chemistry of fluids in general and of water in particular. So in order to understand why these temporary structure occur in a water flow, you will have to understand something about the physical chemistry of a liquid that is flowing. In the same manner, this flow of information that takes place in a human group takes a different aspect when it flows inside our mind brains and when it flows across in our common environment. Like right now, in our common environment, you have a vibration of the air caused by my voice being amplified by the local machinery. So that's information flowing in the environment. And if you're paying attention, there are brain mental processes taking place in every one of your heads, as they are also taking place in mine, so that I can produce this speech. And this flow of information from the environment into heads, into environment, into heads, is what I'm talking about. And what I believe is that to better understand how, at the population level, we get the patterns we get, so how we get social and cultural phenomena, you also have to understand how the information flows in human minds. So again, just as it wouldn't make sense to reduce the study of this population of molecules that you find in a river and of the movement of a river and of, say, whirlpools, vortices like this, to the study of molecules of water. On the other hand, to do it without understanding the molecule of water is again depriving you of a main dimension of intelligibility. So probably there was a time where people were interested in these structures and when they knew nothing about the physics and chemistry of fluids. When this added knowledge was provided, they could develop a better understanding of these movements. Similarly, a major development has occurred in the social and human sciences in the past 50 or 60 years, and that is the development of the cognitive sciences, what has often been called the cognitive revolution. What it has done is provided us with a much better understanding of mental and neural processes than we had before, and that's something that is developing as we speak, and we heard on the first day two interesting contributions directly related to this aspect of scientific development. So we know more about, if you want to go on with the analogy, with the molecules involved in this flow, in this case not molecules but very complex systems, namely mind brains. So I've been trying in my work, as I said, to integrate this understanding of human mind, which is developing so rapidly within the context of the cognitive sciences, with our understanding of social and cultural phenomena. And I want just very briefly to sketch the very elementary in which I do that. So let me introduce just I will be using a notion of causal chains, which is a banal notion. So a causal chain is this causal relationship between events. Events cause other events. A single event, of course, may cause several events. One event may be caused by several. When I say a chain, it may look more like a lattice, but you have chains of events, and if you're interested in causal explanations, these are, in a sense, the raw phenomena that you want to describe. Now, if you look at causal chains in the social domain, they involve two types of events, and I'll be using two different boxes for the two types of events. They involve events that take place in the environment, what I call public. By public, I just mean in the environment, outside, mind external, if you want. Public events, again, like the speech here, but also the reflection of light by the various surfaces and so on in this room, and mental events, events that take place in your mind. And as I already suggested, the flow of information that I was talking about typically is in and out of mind, in and out of the environment. It's a succession of events which are alternatively mental and public in a complex manner. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my work is basically reconceptualize the social in terms of its causal chains. But our understanding of its causal chains, as I suggested, is been modified by the development of cognitive psychology, because here I'm looking at a very broad scale, not going into the details of a public event, of a mental event. What happens in the environment, in the public events, are complex sets of complex events, and so are mental events. And our understanding of the mental events in particular has been radically improved. And one way to represent it, it's my idiosyncratic way of doing that, but it's drawing on an idea that's absolutely common in the study of cognition today, is in terms of what I call cognitive causal chains, or CCCs, if you prefer, cognitive causal chains. So what are cognitive causal chains? They are causal chains where causal links, causal relationship, establish content relationship. So you have a causal process, and that process creates, establishes, realizes a relationship of content between a representation and that which it represents. And not only does that, but it does that because it's its function to do that. It doesn't do that accidentally. So let me give you very simple examples, because I don't want to spend too much time on that. So take the case of perception. Think of simply visual perception, but we could say the same thing for auditory or whatever form of perception. So you have a stimulus. For instance, what you see on the screen is a stimulus. This stimulus reflects light, which brings about changes of energy in the cell in your retina, which brings about complex cognitive processes, which results in the appearance in your mind of a representation which purports to be an identification of a very stimulus that caused it. And if it works well, if perception is veridical, if it works well, then your identification of a stimulus is true of a stimulus. So you have a relation of being true of, which is a content relationship, a semantic relationship. It's a relationship between a representation and that which it purports to represent. It's not a temporal relationship, it's not a causal relationship, it's a formal relationship, it's a semantic relationship, which is brought about in a regular manner by the very process of perception. The process of perception is a process which has as its function to realize this content relationship by resulting in the production of representation which represent the very stimulus that has caused them. And what's been happening with the cognitive revolution, and now even more with the development of neuroscience and neuropsychology, is we understand the material processes, we begin to understand the material processes that makes this possible, that allows you to go from a stimulation of your nerve endings by some distal stimulus to a representation of that stimulus in your head. So that's true of perception, but if you think of motor control, you start with a representation of a state of affair that you desire, or that you want to bring about, which causes a movement of your body. You, for instance, say, I desire to take this bottle. This intention brought about a change in the state of affair, a state of affair which happened to satisfy my intention. And this relationship of satisfaction, just as a relationship of truth before, is a relationship between an intention and some state of affair, which is formal. It's not a causal one, but there's a causal process that regularly delivers this relationship of satisfaction. And again, in the cognitive science of action, we understand better and better how the process involved. Or to now stay within the mind, remember I'm using round boxes for things which are mind internal and square box for events in the environment. If you take a process of inference, so you may have a couple of beliefs, premises, you might want to call them, that play a causal role in the production of a further belief, the conclusion, if you want, which, if things go well, is warranted by the premises, again, a formal content relationship brought about in a regular causal manner. And I could go on, say, think of remembering, another psychological process. You form the belief, say, this morning, now you remember the information that you had perceived this morning, and so the belief you activate now resembles in relevant respect the belief you initially formed, and that's what memory does. And of course, so what psychologists do typically, they specialize in one of these kinds of cognitive processes, of cognitive links. So some are specialists of perception, or even more special, visual perception, auditory perception, olfactory perception, and so on. Others are specialists of memory, others of inference, and so on and so on. But of course, our mental life involves all these different types of causal links in complex chain. And I'm representing one which is extremely simplified, but already brings in some kind of complexity. So suppose, for instance, that you walk out of your house in the morning, and the stimulus is, you see that the street is wet. So you perceive that, you form the belief that the street is wet, but it also the sun is shining, and it's nice and warm. But now you remember that it's Monday, and that every Monday they wash the street. So now through use of memory and perception, you have the premises for an inference to the fact that the street is wet because it's been washed that morning. And now you form a belief that's true of an event that you didn't observe, but that you infer on the basis of your perception and your memory. Again, this is a very kind of rapid kind of thing that we do intuitively, spontaneously, at great speed. And any real bit of mental life would involve a much more complex causal chain than that. But it's a cognitive causal chain, where by cognitive I mean that the various causal processes involved have as their function to realize content relationship. They realize content relationship in a causally reliable manner. Not perfect, but reliable manner. And that's what makes such chains cognitive causal chains. Now, psychologists typically work on the psychological process in an individual, which therefore go from the stimulus to perception all the way to the movement, cognitively controlled movements, which bring about some modification of the immediate environment. And most of what is being studied is what happens in between the input and the output of the individual cognitive system, this complex process of inference, memory, perception, motor control, and so on. But if you accept my definition of a cognitive causal chain, a chain of links where each link realizes, because such is its function, a content relationship, there is no reason why this should be limited to the cognitive process of an individual. So I want to introduce the notion of a social cognitive causal chain, where a social cognitive, social CCC if you prefer, a social CCC is a cognitive causal chain that establishes content relationship across individuals through changes in their common environment. And indeed, a number of our interactions, just as a number of our mental processes, have as a function to establish content relationship, but not inside an individual, but across individuals. So very trivially, communication is such a process. And now I'm using colors for different individuals. So again, round boxes for the mental processes or contents, square boxes for processing the environment. So here blue has a certain meaning in her head that she wants to communicate to yellow. She produces a modification of a common environment by, say, speaking, producing an oral utterance, which is interpreted by yellow. And if things go well, the interpretation resembles in the relevant respect. I wouldn't say it's identical. The identity is not really necessary. Resemble in a relevant respect the meaning intended by blue. And so the communication process is typically a cognitive causal link. It's across individual, but it's not different in this basic definition than the processes of perception or inference or memory that I was talking about. so it gets involved in slightly more complex causal chains. So for instance, yellow observed a certain state of affair that green didn't see, so she produced a testimony through which green constructs a belief about the state of affair that green hadn't himself observed. So it's, some describe that as perception by proxy. I don't think it's, some being Roof-Millikan. I don't like this characterization, but it's, again, it's a cognitive causal change which involves now a series of links, both cognitive processes of formation of belief in yellow, of communication with green, which, and the true belief of green is realized through the help of yellow. Request, here pink has a certain desire that she is not in a position to fulfill by herself, to satisfy by herself, but she can do that by requesting the help of blue. She makes a request, communication, which causes in blue the intention to satisfy that request and causes him to bring about a state of affair that satisfies pink's desire. Again, a cognitive causal chain, but that works across individual. That's a social cognitive causal chain. In these social cognitive causal chains, which come in great variety, nevertheless, you have basically two types of links. You have mental links and public links, two types of cause and effects. And the mental causes are mental processes, mental productions, if you want, in particular the production of mental representations, as you get through perception, through memory, or through inference. And the public causes are public productions, all kinds of events that you produce out of with the help of some cognitive processes, and which provide an input for the cognitive processes of others. And in particular, of course, among the public productions are public representations, like utterances, that is object that has directly the function of producing the production of certain kind of contents in the mind of others. Now, these social cognitive causal chains, I should have put social here, they form a mesh. So if you take any event in social interaction, it is an event in at least one social cognitive causal chain. There is no social interaction which doesn't involve the transfer of information and which is not an instance of a social cognitive causal chain. But typically, every one of our interaction involves not a single social CCCs, but many social CCCs that crisscross one another. So just to give a very simple, the social CCCs typically crisscross one another. In particular, many links in short local social CCCs typically also belong to long spread out CCCs. Let me just give you a very simple example of that. Take the very common practice, I'm sure it exists in Finland too, I didn't check before, that when somebody sneezes, you say something, which is typically a blessing. It's practically, the forms of blessing are very diverse across culture, but I've asked systematically my anthropological friends whether something like that occurs in the society we studied, and the answer is almost always yes. So where I did my fieldwork in the south of Ethiopia, you didn't say bless you, you would say to, if a man was sneezing, you would say kill an elephant or kill a rhinoceros. If you're a woman sneeze, you would say, have boys. And if a child would sneeze, you would say grow up. But in any case, blessings. So here's a very small social CCC, a very small interaction. So John sneezes, that's not a cognitive process, but it creates a stimulus that is perceived by, say, Bill, and Bill forms the intention of saying bless you, or blessing John, and Bill says bless you, and that's where the interaction ends, and then they continue their conversation or whatever they were doing. A very short social interaction, but of a very common kind. But of course, the intention to say bless you and the action of doing so, the whole thing, is just one instance of a long series of such events. I mean, it's not an idea that springs out of the mind of Bill out of nowhere. Bill does that, and in so doing repeats, reproduces what is being done quite regularly in his society. And how come it's getting reproduced again? Each time somebody says bless you to somebody who sneezes, he or she contributes to the practice enduring, being repeated again. If people stop doing that, or do it less and less often, the practice will go. But if each time you hear somebody sneeze, you do that, or most of the time you do that, by doing that, you do two things. One of the things you do is blessing the person who sneezes. The other thing you do is contribute to the stability of that practice in your own society. The second thing is not what you intend to do, but it has that effect. You contribute to stabilizing the practice. You give another instance of a model of action to people around you. You contribute to the higher order idea that this is the right thing to do, and so on. But this is much more, if you think of it, it's completely general. So when you say, when Bill says bless you, he's using words. And when he says bless you, he means bless you, John, and he means them in this particular kind of context. But in using these words, he is repeating, reproducing, and I like to put actually an hyphen between re and produce, reproducing. It's not copying, it's just producing another instance of the word, another token of bless and of you. And each word in our languages stays part of that language by being used. Each time you use a word, of course you do that with the intention of communicating some content to somebody as part of a longer utterance. But in so doing, you do another thing. You contribute to the stability and the permanence of that word in your language. And if you use actually the word with a slightly different meaning, with a shift of, invisible shift of meaning, you're contributing to if other people do the same thing, to the meaning shifting over time. If you do that with a slightly different pronunciation, again, you may be contributing to the phonological change over time. So all our social practices, all our interactions that draw on cultural tools or practices, like saying bless you to somebody who sneezes, or words, and different kind of artifacts, both belong to local social CCCs, to interaction between particular individuals, and to these extended CCCs which stabilize precisely these practices, these tools, these artifacts. So I want to characterize now a specific kind of cognitive causal chain which precisely has that effect of stabilizing content, and I want to call them cultural cognitive causal chains, or CCCCs for short. So social CC, what are cultural cognitive causal chains? What are CCCCs? They are social CCCs that stabilize content across a population. So let me give you an example. So take a folktale. Take Little Red Riding Hood. I keep using Little Red Riding Hood. Every now and then I think I can't use another time Little Red Riding Hood, and I put Jack and the Beanstalk, and then I go back to the next lecture to Little Red Riding Hood. Sorry about that. So, if you think of a folk tale, if you think of it as do many folklorists, many people who study folk tale, what is the tale? Well, it's a fairly abstract structure. It's like, what is a piece of music? What is the Ninth Symphony? Where is it? So where is the Ninth Symphony? Is it in the score, in the performance? Then it's a scattered object in the mind of Beethoven, the mind of people who listen to it. Similarly, where is Little Red Riding Hood? Well, not very clear. So no problem if you think of it as an abstract object. If you think of the Ninth Symphony as an abstract object, the problem of where and when it is doesn't occur. It occurs only if you think of it as a concrete object. Same thing with Little Red Riding Hood. You can study it as an abstract object. It has properties, just like sentences, just like mathematical objects, and so on, which can be studied on an abstract level. And a lot of interesting things can be done in this way. Formalist approaches, say, to folk tales do that. They identify structural properties of folk tales quite independently of where and when these objects exist. So they identify these properties in the objects taken in the abstract. But if you want to explain, as we want as sociologists or anthropologists, how come that there is such a folk tale? How come it has had the kind of success it has? How come it has transformed itself over time, over centuries, and so on? Why some folk tales are more successful than others, and so on. So a number of sociological questions that you may want to ask. Then you can't just turn to the abstract objects, because abstract objects have no causes and no effects. They're not part of the world of cause and effects. Just as the number 5 doesn't cause anything, the abstract object, the Little Red Riding Hood, doesn't cause anything and doesn't have a cause itself. So what you want to turn to are the concrete events which do enter into causal relationship. And what are these concrete events? So these concrete events are both public events, the telling of the tales, when somebody tells the tales, and mental events, people listening to the tales, understanding the tales, remembering the tales, reformulating the tales, and so, well, that is very useless at this juncture. So let's look at, so if you think of a tale like Little Red Riding Hood, it's spread through a series of events, narratives, that is public events, the tale being told, and stories, the mental representation of the tales. And this, what you have here on this screen, is a small fragment of the very extended CCCC, cultural cognitive causal chain, that has spread variations of Little Red Riding Hood over countries and centuries, not just throughout Europe since a long time, but in fact throughout the world. And we could zoom out. So here you have a fragment with just a few people, a dozen people, people who have told the story to other people, who've told it to other people, and so on. We could zoom out and look at much larger populations of people and of events of telling the tale, of events of listening to the tales, of events of recalling the tale, reformulating it, and so on. Moving it to the historical scale, where indeed this very complex chain has an historical beginning and not yet an historical end. Or we could zoom in. We could zoom in, for instance, look at what happens in the head of Blue here. So Blue heard the story from Green and Pink. Again, the whole story is awfully simplified, but and so we could focus, zoom in inside Blue's head. So here we are now inside Blue's head. So she heard the story from Green and Pink, two different narratives, which were not identical, because each and every time somebody tells a tale, he or she uses her own words, a different formulation, possibly makes mistake if that's a proper description. But then, you don't even notice these differences. I mean, you're told the same story. You don't notice the difference in wording. And even though you heard two stories which were not exactly identical, they coalesce, they get synthesized by some mental process of remembering, of memory storage, into a single story. And when Blue is motivated to do so, because, for instance, children have asked her, please, Grandma, tell us the story of Little Red Riding Hood, she formulates, she has to find, because what you remember is not in form of words, it's the story that you remember, it's not a text. She has to reformulate, and she produces a narrative again. This may look like too much psychology for anthropologists, but of course for psychologists it's far too little, because you could move, the cognitive causal chain involved in reformulation, in remembering, in storing, in motivations are quite complex. Again, we can zoom in and out. A parenthesis about this zoom metaphor. Two things to say about it. One of the arguments that I've made in my work is that the relationship between, say, anthropology and psychology shouldn't be thought as one between two levels of reality, or two levels of description, but that has a difference of scale. You're looking at the same objects, but you can zoom in and out. And I borrowed the metaphor of a zoom from Bruno Latour, who was using it to make fun of it, to say that's the silly idea of a zoom. And I thought, that's not a silly idea, it's a great idea. So now I use, thanks to Bruno, the metaphor of a zoom. I think it's exactly the way we want to move across these disciplines, from neurology to psychology to anthropology, is by zooming in and out and seeing the same things at different scales. So the difference are difference of scale. So we could, take a different scale, go deeper into psychology. We could take a completely different scale and go to a historical dimension. But we would all the time be looking at the same object. Let me give you another example of a CCCC, of a cultural cognitive causal chain. Well, you might not immediately see the cultural artifact, but there is a cultural artifact, namely a path. A path is something that is very, it's an artifact produced by the inhabitants of a village in a forest in order to go, say, from that village to, say, a river nearby. And how was it, how did it happen, and how was it maintained? Well, maybe you can imagine a story where a first group of settlers arrived and settled for one night, deciding where not to settle for longer in a certain clearing where now the village is. And a group of people went and looked for the river, walking more or less in line. There was a lot of growth here and so on, but breaking branches and stepping, following the step each one of a person before, because that's the easiest way to do, coming back the same way. And the next day, if they like the place, if the path turned out to be useful, using the same steps. And every time somebody walks the path, he or she contributes to the very existence of the path, to the maintenance of this artifact, which is both a tool to guide the cognitive function, to guide their steps. It's also an object that's represented in their mind. They know they have a mental map of the space in which they live, a mental map of a terrain which is also built by their own creations. And if you want to represent the causal chain of such a path, each person who walks the path pays attention to where the path is and walks it, and steps precisely where other people have stepped before, or like the little Bobby who is following his mom is just following somebody who is doing that. But whether they follow the path or not, what they follow in following the path is all the people who walk the path before them, and that's what makes it a path. So, the story I've told so far with just these two examples, and many more would be needed, and I've taken very simple examples, a tale, a path, and so on, involves some kind of relatively repetitive or reproductive practice of telling the same story, of walking the same path, and so on. And a lot of cultural phenomena, or repeating the same word and so on, can be described in those terms. Free-floating stories. Little Red Riding Hood is true. When people want to tell it, they tell it. They don't want to tell it, they don't tell it. They don't have to tell it. But it somehow is attractive enough and memorable enough for the story to bounce back and back and back and back again and stabilize as a very fundamental feature of European popular culture. But what about institutions? Go back to the whirlpool, to the vortices in the water I was talking about. The real important regular patterns that play a crucial role in the flow of information and that are of particular relevance in our discussion here are institutions, like, for instance, colloquium, museums, universities, and they seem to call for something quite different from a discussion in terms of a flow of information, another type of phenomenon being involved. Well, I want to argue no. It's the same type of phenomena that's taking place, but with a certain kind of complexity. So let me just introduce that by imagining a tale now, not Little Red Riding Hood, but a tale which is in some sense an institutional tale. That is, it's not that people tell it just when they want to, and it's successful just because people tell it because they happen to want to tell it. But it's a tale which is told because there is some kind of rule, some kind of norm to the effect that it should be told. So it's a Christmas tale. So it's part of the ritual of Christmas to tell it on Christmas Eve. In this case, you have the same thing you had before, but now Blue is motivated in particular by a rule. Now, a rule in this story, what is a rule? Well, a rule in this story is going to be a representation of a rule. It's going to be a mental representation that causes Blue. She knows about the rule that you should tell this story on Christmas Eve, and so she now is going to tell this Christmas tale on Christmas Eve. But how does the rule itself come to her mind? Well, the rule itself has its pattern of distribution. The rule itself is distributed through a cultural cognitive causal chain. So she heard the rule mentioned by others, and that's how she, so just as the story, she was told the story, she was told the rule. She may also have observed people telling the story on Christmas Eve and saying, this is what we ought to do. And she herself, just as she may tell the tale, she may also be a transmitter of a rule. She will tell the rule. When she tells the tale, she says, and now it's Christmas Eve, and I will tell you this tale, and so on. So now what you get are two cultural cognitive causal chains, one which distributes the rule, and the other which distributes the tale. And they are related. So the causal chain which distributes the rule plays a causal role in the distribution of a tale. The two are related in a manner such that the distribution of a lower level kind of representation, but it could be the exchange of artifact of object. It doesn't have to be about representation. It could be about, giving flowers, giving chocolate, killing people. It could be just whatever you want. If you have a higher order rule which says how some kind of artifact, practice, representation is to be distributed in such a manner that this higher level distribution plays a causal role in the lower level representation, you have an institution, an institutional phenomenon, which is one type again of pattern in the flow of information with this complex relationship between two levels of representation. And I want to characterize institutions in this manner. An institution, on this view, is characterized by a complex pattern of distribution of cultural items, where some higher level representations are, by the way, lower level representations or practices or artifacts are to be distributed, and where the distribution of the higher level representations plays a causal role in the distribution of a lower level one. So think of a lecture. Here I'm distributing some kind of content, hopefully, but I'm doing that because of higher order representation, which resulted in my being invited, asked to give a lecture, told what type of topic it should be about. You are here because there were higher order representation which informed you of the presence of this lecture. The whole thing was made possible by even higher order representation, but who is in position to issue an invitation to a lecture and so on and so on. And you could consider more and more complex institutions, but they again move not just words, lectures and so on, they move objects, they build buildings, they declare wars, they do lots of things, but it's always ebbs in the flow of cultural information. So the causal chain of, you get the rule playing a causal role in the tale. So what I've done so far, and we will soon break and have a musical interlude or illustration, what I've done so far is introduce a few conceptual tools. The notion of cognitive causal chains as a way to think of cognitive processes in a way that we could smoothly integrate in our interest in social phenomena, by indeed introducing the notion of social cognitive causal chains, a particular place given to those long social cognitive causal chains that stabilize cultural contents, practices, artifacts, and so on, and the idea that institutions are not a different kind of object, they are a complexification of this kind of objects. And at this point, we will get an illustration of cognitive causal chains, if I understand well, of a musical character. Well, thank you very much. So, I wanted an illustration of the fact that, of the very idea of this, cultural cognitive causal chain. So we got a very nice one. And it also anticipates what's going to be the second part of the talk, if I find my little gadget, which has to do with the fact that contrary to a widespread view, again, we're not dealing with copying or imitation. So it's not that people copy one another and sometimes make a mistake, as in the case of biological evolution. The processes of cultural transmission involve more creative and constructive aspect, just as we saw now. And this is what, how am I doing time-wise? Yes, if you allow me, I will continue with some more points. So, if you have in mind this general framework in terms of social and particularly cultural cognitive causal chains, we may reapproach two of the very basic tasks of anthropology. So the first task is explaining cultural diversity, and that's what has been at the center of the interest of anthropologists. Human cultural diversity is indeed absolutely extraordinary. It's been incredibly richly documented by anthropologists and also discussed in great details. It's got to be explained. How can an animal species like Homo sapiens produce ways of life which are so radically different from one another as do human beings? But there's another task that is less paid attention to, and that, if you think about it, is difficult too. And that is explaining cultural stability. How come that this animal species, population in this animal species, are able to stabilize a rich, complex set of practices, habits, tools, artifacts, symbols, and so on, of incredible complexity as we do find among human beings. There is nothing impossible in imagining an intelligent species that would not stabilize much by the way of culture. As you mentioned earlier, in discussion of culture, we know that other species also stabilize a certain number of practices, typically skills, chimpanzees, corvids, and so on. But in their case, what you find is that in certain animal species, a population may have stabilized maybe one, maybe two, maybe at best a dozen or several dozen at the great maximum it has ever been claimed, distinct, simple practices or artifacts involved in the way they manage the environment and interact with each other. In the human case, if you just consider the fact that the human language has tens of thousands of words, we start with a variety of items, a number of items that's just way beyond of an order of magnitude. Add to this all the beliefs, customs, practices, artifacts, and so on that involve. The complexity of human culture is without par. And how come that these get indeed reproduced with enough stability that we can tell them as being the same culture, the same word, and so on. So let me focus on explaining cultural stability. Now, there is what I believe is a fallacious solution to the problem, a fallacious solution that is generally accepted in the literature and even kind of systematically explored now in a certain number of biologically inspired models of cultural evolution, and which goes like this. So cultural items exhibit a degree of macro stability that's sufficient for them to be recognized as cultural in the first place. So you can register Little Red Riding Hood in all traditions again and again. Again, as I said, there are differences and so on, but you can recognize each and every time Little Red Riding Hood. You can study, say, food tradition, and so you can analyze apple pies, which are made, in cultural tradition. So each apple pie is a bit different from every other apple pie, but you can tell it's an apple pie and it's different from a cheesecake or whatever. So you can identify types of cultural artifacts, type of text, type of values, word, and so on. Again, in spite of a degree of variation that you find, they can be recognized as being tokens of the same type. And if you couldn't do that, you would not identify anything as being cultural. To say that something is cultural is to say it's being reproduced, again, with some variations. So the argument goes, the micro-mechanism of cultural transmission must possess the degree of fidelity required to explain this micro-stability. Again, why is stability a puzzle? Why is there something to explain? Especially, and as an anthropologist, I do that very spontaneously. If you think of societies which don't have external memories like writing, libraries, universities, or the internet, and nevertheless stabilize rich cultures. So how do they do that? How come that the things are not transformed beyond recognition or just forgotten from one step to the next? So one simple idea is, well, people are very good at copying. They are very good at imitating. So they copy, they reproduce without an hyphen from one step to another. Why isn't that a good solution? Because if you actually look, rather than postulating that the mechanism of the micro mechanism of transmission must be faithful enough, must have enough fidelity to explain stability, if you actually look at this mechanism, what you see is a very different picture. So two kinds of mechanisms are being involved. Sometimes you take a public event or object, and an agent, an individual, represents it mentally and reproduces it. So that's imitation, if you want. So I do this, and you do this. And another person does it, and so on. So imitation does occur, and human beings, in fact, are the only species, apart from parrots, who do a very special kind of imitation, who are fairly good at imitation. Human beings imitate much more than any other animal, and certainly more than apes, which are not particularly good at imitating. They do some imitation, but limited. And imitation, in fact, when we talk about imitation, we're talking about a variety of different cognitive practices and cognitive mechanisms. So it's not a single imitation mechanism, it's a range of phenomena. So from public to public through mental, that's imitation. From mental to mental through public, I have a certain idea, I want to communicate to you. For that, I produce a public event, namely an utterance in this case, that's communication. Again, many different forms of transmission from mental to mental through some public event constitute the communication range, which can be done in lots of ways. And so these are the things which have to be faithful enough for the story, for the fallacious solution to work. If you spell it out, the idea that culture is stabilized by the fidelity of the transmission mechanism. These are the two types of mechanism involved. And that's not really enough, because in any case, the public events can be modified by ecological processes. So speech vanishes immediately. Writing, depending on what you write on, may vanish, may be destroyed. A number of cultural productions are modified by erosions or other ecological processes. If you think of a transmission of cultivars, cultivated plants, for instance, and so on. And so here you need some stability too. And you get it easily for certain things, but not for others. And memory. So of course, you tell me a story. Suppose I understood it perfectly. Communication worked perfectly. Still, if I'm going to retell it, I need to remember it exactly. Well, we know memory is not like that. I mean, all the psychology of memory show how much it's a constructive process and how much it involves reworking whatever you've remembered. So in fact, and I don't have time to go into that, but I've devoted a lot of my work to that kind of issue, variations are the norm rather the exception at the level of individual episode of memory storage, retrieval, imitation, and communication. Typically, we're not in the business of producing copies. Memory doesn't produce copy. Understanding what somebody tells you doesn't put in your mind a copy of what the person had in mind. I don't expect you to come out of this lecture with a copy of what I had in mind. If you get 5% of the message, I'll be happy. That's already an ambitious goal. And you're not trying to get a full copy of what I'm saying. It's not relevant to you. So it's not a failure of communication. Communication isn't in the business of producing copies. So how come then that there is a relative stability at the macro level of a distribution of cultural presentation, practice, and artifact, if it's not the fidelity of copy at every step? Is there another way to think of it? Doesn't it have to be that somehow the copying is faithful enough? Well, I want to insist that in transmission mechanism, in communication, in imitation, in memory also, there are both preservative, copying, if you want, aspect and constructive aspects in transmission mechanism. One's goal in imitating, interpreting, communication, or remembering are hardly ever purely preservative. So if you imitate, so for instance, you have a friend who produces a really beautiful apple pie. So you want to imitate her. So you look the way she does things. But your goal is not to reproduce all her gestures. Your goal is to learn, to pick from the information that you observe the ability to do an apple pie to your liking. It's not to do. So when do you actually, in imitation, try to copy exactly? If you forge money, you want the copy to be really as much as possible like the original. Or if you chorus dancing, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at it, but you get a chorus line, and each dancer is supposed to have exactly the same movement as the next one. But these are exceptions. In general, when you imitate, you observe some kind of artifact or some kind of behavior, and you try to get from it the information that's relevant for you to produce something that will satisfy your goals, which may be very close to the goals of the others, but maybe also partly different. Same thing in communication. As I said, when you listen to me, your goal is not to fill your mind with a copy of all of my meaning. You have no use to it. It's to pick whatever is relevant to you in what I'm saying. You're using whatever your interpretation to get not a copy of my meaning, but some kind of representation that's relevant to you. And same thing in memory. So the mechanism involved, they combine preservative and constructive processes, always. Now, some constructive processes converge across individuals and situations and make a crucial contribution to cultural stability. The fact that we don't copy doesn't mean that we cannot stabilize contents. The issue is some of these constructive processes are a factor of stability. Some are not. Some have to do with each idiosyncratic interest, capacities, and so on, and produce divergence. But in many respects, our constructive processes converge. So constructive processes can contribute to cultural stability provided that they converge. And I may want to leave room for discussion. So I will go very rapidly over what I want, the stuff I have here. So here are two kinds of psychological factors that I want to talk about of convergence. One is modularity, the other is relevant. So modularity is the idea that we have special, if you don't like the word modules, there's been lots of discussion, forget it. We have specialized dispositions which cause us to interpret certain type of stimulus in a recurrent manner, in a systematic manner. The mind-brain contains many specialized mechanisms or modules that contribute to the stabilization of cultural contents that meet the input conditions. Each module is characterized by a domain. It's specialized in handling a certain kind of data. I will give example in an instant. So, and it's evolved, or it's been developed in order to treat a certain kind of domain of information. Its proper domain is the set of inputs. It is its function to process. So we have a specialized capacity to attend to language, to a language which is our mother tongue. It takes away other noises and pays attention just to the noise of language. It's its proper domain. The actual domain of a module is the set of input that satisfies its input condition. So if somebody produces sounds which are very much like words but which are not, they will nevertheless attract your attention. Your speech recognition modules will be activated by an input which is in its actual domain but not in its proper domain. So one way of representing that is the proper domain is in green, the actual domain, so proper domain, what it is supposed to do, what its function the information is its function to process. In red, you have the actual domain, what it actually processes. And when it fails to process something it should, you have false negatives. When it processes things as if they were in its domain, which are not, you have false positive. Let me illustrate immediately. So imagine a snake detector. Many animals, possibly humans, have a snake detector, an instinctive reaction to snakes. In this case, you may expect that we tend to have very few false positive and many false negative. That is, with a kind of better safe than sorry kind of principle. Not only will you very readily identify a snake on the basis of some very simple features, but you may identify a movement in the grass as being caused by a snake, a snake-like branch as being a snake. So the actual domain will be wider because better to have false positive than to have false negative. Take a berry detector. Take animals that eat berries, like us actually. So you eat berries, you pick berries. Well, we're pretty good at that. We don't pick the wrong ones. I mean, berries which may look similar enough, we don't. So we're fairly conservative. Better miss many berries than eat a poisonous berry which is not of the kind that you want. So you get a mismatch between what are psychological mechanism for picking certain kind of information or processing certain kind of information actually do to what is their function of doing. So this mismatch between the proper and the actual domain can be caused by the probabilistic character of cognition. Cognition is an activity at a risk. It doesn't, changes in the environment. So you are ready for a certain kind of stimulus, but now there are new items in the environment that modifies it. And what is more relevant, in many cases, such a mismatch can result from the exploitation of the input condition of a module by other organisms of the same or different species. Again, I will illustrate. So the fact that we have this predisposition makes us manipulable, vulnerable to manipulation by others. So what is this animal? Come on. Sorry? A flower bee? No, it's not a bee at all. It's not a bee. It's not a wasp. It's a fly. It's a hoverfly. It's just a fly. But it mimics. It's a case of classical case of mimicry. It mimics a wasp, which causes a number of predator birds that avoid eating wasp because it can be dangerous to them, not to eat the hoverfly. So what it does in our fake, it's a false positive for the wasp detectors of these predator birds. It's in the actual domain of a wasp detector without being in its proper domain, and it saves the life of overflies. So maybe, but now, so this is interspecies type of exploitation of modules. Let's look at inside species exploitation. Humans are not only users, but also massive producers of information. They produce information particular to influence others. So I produce a lot of information without any particular intention towards others, but now I'm trying to influence you. I'm producing information this lecture in order, maybe manipulate is not the word I want to use, especially if I want to convince you, but to have a certain effect on you, to influence you. And to influence others by means of a cognitive input, it must attract its attention. If you don't pay attention, I don't have a chance of influencing you. And it must be processed in a predictable way. I must have some good idea of how you're going to understand what I'm saying. A reliable way, it's not the only one, to attract attention and guide cognitive processes is to produce input that satisfy the input conditions of cognitive modules. So what happens is, and again I will illustrate shortly, is that the actual domain of our cognitive modules, the type of information that we end up processing, contains not just information that meets its input condition, information that we are naturally disposed or that we developed in order to treat, but also information that belongs to its proper, not just information that belongs to its proper domain or there by mistake, it contains cultural information that is systematically and intentionally produced so as to meet the input conditions. So what I want to argue is that in the human case, you don't have just the actual domain and the proper domain. You have something that you can call the cultural domain or domains of a module. Culturally developed parts of the actual domain of a module are a cultural domain. Let's take an example which will make it clear. So what is this? What is this? It's Charlie Chaplin. It's not Charlie Chaplin. It's a display. It's a black and white two-dimensional projection on a screen. Charlie Chaplin is dead. His bird is not here. So it's not. But you're right. Very good. It's a picture of Charlie Chaplin, which we already see as Charlie Chaplin. So one of the human social life depends on our ability to recognize one another and interpret the faces of one another. So you recognize Charlie Chaplin, young Charlie Chaplin, and you can do that. You don't need the actual face of Charlie Chaplin. You don't need the colors. You don't need the three dimensions. Black and white pictures will do that. In fact, this will do it too. And that's really very different from a face. I mean, you have these white marks on a black background, discontinuous and so on, and you see Charlie Chaplin. So that tells you something about the input condition of a face detection module. It overreacts to very specific patterns, and it doesn't care about all the rest of elements which are in fact de facto conditions for something to be a face. In an environment where you don't produce pictures of faces, this kind of pattern will be typically produced by faces. So what is this? That's a real face, but it's an interesting case, because it's a real face that you interpret differently because of the makeup. So it's a face that has been transformed to activate a certain disposition to interpret red lips in a certain manner, dark eyes in a certain manner, and so on. And what is this? This is not a face at all, but it activates your face recognition module. You recognize it as a face. It's not a face at all. You're not even mistaken about it. But you've got the cognitive resources, which it's a super stimulus for it. It activates your face recognition and interpretation capacity in a great manner. So what happens is we have a face recognition and interpretation module, which has as its proper domain actual faces. But in a cultural context, and again in a natural environment, there are precious few things which activate it beside actual faces. A face in the moon, a cloud, no, very, very little. It's natural environment. The only face-like objects almost are faces. But in a cultural environment, you have portraits, you have masks, which are part of the actual domain without being part of the proper domain. And even the proper domain has made-up faces, which are culturally constructed objects. So the existence of a face recognition interpretation module makes it possible to develop a variety of cultural artifacts, portraits, masks, makeup, and so on, that get different interpretation from everybody, but converging interpretation because the modules, the psychological mechanisms we use are the same. I will pass rapidly about the role of relevance in cultural stabilization. So another kind of psychological factor that plays a role is that shared context and disposition cause attention to the same stimuli and convergent interpretation. When we share a context, even though each of our interpretation is our own as constructive aspect, is construction made with the same ingredients using similar cognitive abilities, and you get convergent interpretation. And when the context changes, particularly when you get historical change of shared context, this causes cultural changes. I will leave that for time's sake. So I've mentioned cognitive factors of convergence. Let me just one word about ecological. As you know, the causal chains are partly mental, partly environmental, mental and public. You get properties of a physical environment which also play a role in stabilization. So things like the availability of natural resources, object affordances, which is what I want to illustrate. So various objects lend themselves to different types of behavior, which determine convergent ways of using them. So take these two examples. How did you learn to ride a bike? So the standard story is you imitated and you were instructed. Well, so you saw people ride a bike and you were told how to do it, and then you went on the bike, and you know what happened? You fell down. You failed. And you tried again, and you fell again, and you fell again. So what happened was you discovered progressively, in a creative and constructive manner, how you can get a certain kind of dynamic equilibrium when you move on the bike. And everyone who knows how to ride a bike rediscovered for him or herself some basic affordance of the object. So instruction and imitation did play a role, but the convergence in the way we ride a bike is determined by the dynamics of bicycle and not by cultural practices. Or take scissors. So maybe you learned scissors, say, from your mother. And maybe your mother was very bad at using scissors and you're a virtuoso. How come? Because the scissors told you how to move them and you developed your own skills. Imitations plays a very limited role, because once you understand why you put that there is something to be done with scissors, again, the affordance of the object causes the conversion. I'm taking this very simple example, but there are more interesting and complex ones that I have no time to do about. Social networks, constraints, and opportunities are in other areas. You get a certain distribution or presentation. You get, and just one more word about that, communication technologies changes the flow of information in a radical way. And I'm coming close to my conclusion, which again can be a source of divergence or convergence again, and so on, and so many other phenomena. So in explaining stability with low fidelity, fidelity in transmission is too low to explain cultural stability. Transformation are not random, nevertheless, they converge to what can be called attractors. And factors of attraction can be mental and environmental, and attraction is crucial in explaining cultural stabilities. These attractors are due to a combination of mental and environmental factors, and so they change in historical time. They're not just elements of human nature, if you want, of an immutable human nature. They are in part linked to the basic makeup of human beings, but also to the conditions in which human beings live, conditions that they themselves develop. So let me conclude by going back to my initial metaphor and try to make it more directly relevant to the theme of this particular meeting. If we want to think about not the whole flow of information in the human population, but particularly the flow of, for instance, scientific knowledge, or the various topics that we teach in schools or in universities, or of research, or the flow of political ideologies and so on. I think it would be helpful to understand this flow by joining the macro and micro level of phenomena, the vortices, the whirlpool, and the physics of water molecules, and in this case, the classical form recognized by sociology of cultural systems, institutions, and so on, and the microprocesses of transmission, mental representation, and so on, without which these would not exist. The population scale articulation of which makes these macro phenomena what they are. It will also be helpful to understand the transformation of the flow of information in human population, in particular in recent time. One of the things that's been happening is that the speed of the flow of information, or if you prefer to go on with the metaphor, the fluidity, as opposed to the viscosity of this information, has been radically altered. It's been altered when writing was invented, when printing was invented, but of course with the advent of the internet, less than, what was it, 40 years ago, just yesterday, less than 40 years ago, a new speed of flow of information came about, causing different types of structure in the pattern of the flow. The web has less than 30 years. Google and blogs, what, less than 15? And as François Tadei was saying yesterday, or was it this morning? Yesterday. One thing we do know is that we don't know the future. We don't know the future, in particular, of the technologies of transmission of information and on the impact they will have on the cultural flow of information in human population. So when we are thinking of what should be done, what could be done about acting for better changes, better forms of transmission of knowledge, there are various ways in which we can go. Yehuda told us of his interest in developing a new curriculum for the transmission of knowledge at the university level. And indeed, there are deep and profound reasons why this is needed along the line you suggest. At the same time, if you think of that in the context of universities more or less as we know them, you're kind of improving a boat which is for floating on a regular river when you're coming to rapids. We are moving into an era of fantastic turbulences in the flow of cultural information. Turbulences which can be extremely favorable, productive, useful in many ways, but where, in particular, the relatively stable structure that we're used to are going to be radically transformed in a way that we cannot predict. So much of our effort has to be in the way of being ready to welcome, exploit, understand the novelties as they arrive, being very experimental, rather than having a fixed blueprint for what has to be done. We've got to be ready to let experimental approaches flourish and try to guide them just in the way you can guide the movement of a boat in the rapids. You may go much faster, and that may be desirable, but not by having decided on a very specific course. So I will end with this. Thank you.